my name is Joe Thompson. I work for a company called Clarity Business Solutions that I doubt any of you have ever heard of. We're a small company based roughly between DC and Baltimore. We're very close to BWI Airport, but I work remotely. So I actually work from my own home in West Virginia, which is beautiful. It's also beautiful to be able to do that still. And what I work in our MongoDB practice there, which is interesting because I'm fairly new to MongoDB myself, but what they hired me for was my Kubernetes expertise. So just a little bit about me. I've been in IT for almost 30 years, as we're going to find out. I have been Kubernetes enabled, you might say, since 2015, so going on 10 years. It's always interesting when I see job descriptions that are like, you must have 8, 9, 10, 11 years of Kubernetes experience. And it's like, you know, that's like 300 people in the world, right? Like, it's a little more than that, but there's very few people that go back that far. Companies that I've worked for in the past, HashiCorp, Mesosphere, CoreOS, Red Hat, among others. Currently, like I said, I'm a consulting engineer for Clarity Business Solutions. Some basic contact info there. Now, don't worry, you don't need to take a picture of this. All of that is linked, and at the end of this, there will be a QR code that you can scan that goes to the online copy of these slides, which has already been posted. So if you were here for my workshop where I hadn't quite posted it yet, people were telling me, your link is 404. I was like, I know, it hasn't been posted yet. This has actually been posted and is fully up to date. Okay, so let me get a show of hands. Who's here at their very first scale? Okay, so quite a few people. All right. Who here, if anyone, it's a fairly small crowd, has ever had to run an internal certificate authority for something you were doing at work? Okay, we've got a few there. All right, I guess given the topic, that's not that unusual. Who's ever had to deal regularly with a public certificate authority? Okay, now keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Now, keep your hand up if you enjoyed doing that. Okay, maybe like one person enjoyed doing that. I'm guessing either you had a really nice certificate authority or you didn't have to deal with them much. Anything beyond just setting up Let's Encrypt. Yeah, like you actually had to call them up and show them like some kind of identification, and they said, okay, prove who you are. Okay, so what are we going to cover? Well, first we're going to rewind to where things started. All right, this is like at the very beginning of my career. Then we're going to go over in surface level detail the mess that we are currently in with TLS infrastructure on the internet. And then we'll take a look at maybe where we go from here. Okay, I said this kind of before. This is a rant, okay? This is basically me just putting a very light amount of restraint on a rant that many people I work with have heard me launch into different pieces of, okay? I am intentionally taking a very hard, unsubtle line here that the current situation cannot continue, okay? I am not trying to be unfair to anyone. I'm not particularly concerning myself with nuance, subtlety, or whether I think that I might or might not be exactly understood. So if somebody feels they're being unfairly treated by what I say here, I apologize for that in advance, but I also do kind of think maybe you need to take a look at what's going on. Unfortunately, I only touch on the surface level of most of this because it is fractally bad. Every time you take one piece of it and you start looking at it and going, okay, what is going on there? There are deeper levels of awfulness the longer you look at it. And you'll take one tiny piece of that awfulness and you'll start looking at it and there will be deeper levels of awfulness yet. And finally, I take the approach of I don't try to propose an authoritative solution. Frankly, smarter people than me have tried. Mostly they haven't been successful, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you I have the one weird trick, right? But what I am trying to do is at least get an idea of, yes, it really is as bad as I say it is, and give you some idea maybe of the shape of what could replace it that might be at least somewhat better. Okay, so we're going to rewind time. We're going back to early 1995. Yeah, it's not 3,000 years, but it's pretty darn long ago. X-Files is on TV. It's in the second season. We're actually starting to get some of the mythos of the show developed. I was finishing my first, and it turned out my last full year at the University of Virginia. I would drop out shortly after that year finished. And a bunch of Netscape engineers got together and said, let's make the whole infrastructure of internet security this tottering pile of just a mess of hacks. No, that's not what they said. What were they trying to do? Okay? What they were trying to do was something that literally had not been done yet. They were trying to provide a way for web browsers and other clients to do secure communications across HTTP transactions. Now, there's an answer for this. You have an untrusted channel that you have to establish a trusted, secure communication across. Public key cryptography, okay? You have private keys, you have public keys. Private keys can do certain things, public keys can do certain other things. The important thing is that what you encrypt with a public key cannot be decrypted by that public key, only by the private key that pairs with it. So what you have to do to establish a secure channel is you each have to send a public key to each other, and then you can do secure communications. Each of you can encrypt messages to the other with your public key, and they can decrypt it with their private key. Okay, so that's easy to do. If I want to establish a secure channel with somebody, I say, do you have a public key? I have a public key. I send them mine, they send me theirs. But who am I talking to? There's no identity associated with that. I don't necessarily know who I'm talking to unless I actually, and this used to be a thing back in the day to some extent, there were key signing parties. You would all physically get together and you would pull out your floppy disks, that's what it was back then, and everybody would pull up PGP or later GPG, and they would pull out their private keys and they would sign each other's public keys. And so now I have met you face to face, I have verified who you are, I have seen your public key, and I've signed it, so now somebody else who trusts my key can then kind of inherently trust that key that I signed as well, because they know, or at least they assume, that I saw you face to face, okay? But if you don't do that, if you don't have some out-of-band way of establishing identity, then an attacker intercepting the beginning of that communication can send you their key instead of the other party's key, okay? And now you have a problem because the attacker is the one running the show. What we're doing here is we're getting ready for e-commerce. We're getting ready for money to start changing hands over the internet. It was kind of already happening, just on the principle of good faith. People assumed that, well, nobody really wants to pay that much attention to my traffic. So it's not like nobody could do e-commerce at all until TLS came along, but there was a risk factor, right? And I remember very distinctly back then, I was like, who would ever send their credit card number over the internet? What in the heck? Why would you do that? You're just asking to get your bank account drained. Okay, so enter the certificate authority. All right, so you have a third party that you go to and say, this is who I am, and this is my public key, and they, as a third party, sign your certificate of who you are and that contains your public key. And they have already published their own certificate, and people have trusted them already. So again, we have that concept of like transitive trust. I trust the certificate authority. The certificate authority trusted you enough to sign your request. Therefore, I trust that you are who you claim to be. Now, this was not something that was made up out of whole cloth, and that's actually a little bit of the problem. This was something that was pulled out of the X500 directory standard. Now, if you go back and you read what people were writing about this a couple of years after they did this, you'll actually find, and I found a document that I swear I couldn't find again. I wanted to link it in this presentation. It was a guy who said, basically, he 3 or 4 years after SSL was published, he took a look at it and he said, it mostly works okay. There's some problems that we still have to solve, but I'm sure they'll get solved, and this will all be fine, right? But some of those problems came from the fact that it was originally from the X500 directory system that assumed basically a unified global directory with directory authorities who knew the identities of everybody in the directory, right? Because usually it would be like a corporate directory essentially, right? Or an institutional directory, and so you would start work, you would go into the X500 directory. If you got promoted, your title would change as you got promoted. If you left, you would be deleted from the directory. If you had a certificate in the directory, somebody who had control over every system in the company could delete your certificate from every place that it needed to be deleted. Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that. Okay? So we've got this thing. It's kind of put together from existing pieces. It mostly works okay, but people are already starting to look at it and go, I don't know. How do I trust that CA's identity? All right, I don't obviously go over to the, at the time it was the VeriSign office. I could have, because they weren't that far away from me, but I didn't like rock up to the VeriSign office and say, show me your public key. Okay? Your browser and your operating system have certificates preloaded from various certificate authorities that are pre-trusted. They are the root of trust. Okay, I know I'm probably giving a lesson in TLS that a lot of people here don't need, but for the people watching on video, this may be useful background. Okay, so I said certificate authorities deemed trustworthy. Deemed by who and based on what? Okay, that's an important question. And the answer is, well, the answer is, okay, moving on. So how does this actually work in practice? Okay, your browser requests a secure connection to a site. The site sends back a certificate chain. That's the end leaf certificate that identifies that site, plus the certificate that signed that, plus there may be a certificate that signed that. Okay, back to, these certificates ultimately have to connect in a complete chain back to some trusted root that is already trusted by your system. Okay, once that chain of certificates is verified that it anchors to a trusted root, now you, or your browser, knows that the public key in that server certificate is the correct public key for the entity that presented the certificate, that is the real entity, that is, Citibank or whoever, right? Or that's how it is assumed to work. Okay? And of course it works, because nothing is ever going to subvert that process, ever. CAs will never be untrustworthy. They will never have technical issues. There will never be technical attacks on their infrastructure that make anything untrustworthy about the way they operate. Okay? I don't know what to tell you, man. It was the 90s. We hadn't figured a lot of this out yet. Literally, there was not SSH. I looked up the dates. SSL was published in April of 95, and SSH was published in October of that year. So at this time, it was totally routine for people to do things like log into remote systems and clear text across the global internet, right? So the fact that we had this system at all was seen as oh yeah, that's a big advance. That's way more secure than what we had before. And to be fair, it was, but the cracks were already starting to show up. Okay, so where did we end up? It's not a good place. There is no inherent limitation on which CAs can issue certificates for which sites. Any CA can issue a certificate for any site by default. Now, because of different issues and incidents in the past, you will occasionally see a browser announce that they will no longer trust certificates issued by a given certificate authority outside of, for example, its own nation's TLD. Okay? But that is an exception. By default, every certificate can issue a certificate for every domain on the internet. Sometimes CAs make mistakes. Sometimes they take shortcuts because the data that they're assuming that they can get to verify the validity of the request is not there. Now, there was an interesting incident with this where one certificate authority, and I can't remember which one it was, but they were looking up in the global whois the identity of who was the administrator for each domain so that they could send an email to that administrator address and say, hey, we got a certificate request, please verify. Well, the one registrar that they were doing this to didn't return, for privacy reasons, did not return that email in plain text. Okay, it returned basically a GIF of the text of the email address. And so this registrar said, well, we're just going to do optical character recognition on that. Well, it turned out that OCR was a little buggy, and so it was actually possible, and somebody demonstrated the possibility of, and they found out it was possible because they mistakenly got a validation request for a domain they didn't own. And so they said, well, how in the world did that happen? And they figured it out. And they proved that you could subvert this, basically. You could register a domain that was close enough that an OCR error on that domain would result in basically your address getting the validation request for a domain you didn't own. So that was a whole thing. And I saw that and I was like, why was a CA doing optical character recognition at all? Well, that's why, because somebody was trying to keep people from getting spammed, essentially, which is a noble goal, but in this case led to this kind of subversion. Sometimes CAs just aren't very good at doing their jobs. Happens to us all, right? There have been multiple instances in the past of CAs who it came out that because of one lapse or another, their certificates could no longer be trusted. Now, the interesting thing about this is when this happens, or when various other kinds of detrusting of CAs happen, it usually doesn't take the form of all the certificates you issued up to this point are not trusted, because that would break a lot of stuff. What the browser makers and the OS vendors do is they say any certificates you issue after this date will not be trusted. In other words, we've stopped trusting you for any new certificates, but because of practicalities of the internet, we have to keep trusting you for the validity period of the certificates you already issued. It's exactly backwards of the way you would normally do it. But again, it's just that all of this stuff is so deeply embedded before anybody really thought about the consequences that this is all you can really do. CAs are sometimes fooled by bad actors and issue fraudulent certificates. They issued it. It's not a hack. They just issued it to a person they shouldn't have issued it to. VeriSign did this way back in the day. This was back in 2001. Somebody claiming to represent Microsoft.com applied for a code signing certificate from VeriSign. And VeriSign, because of, again, the vagaries of how they validated ownership or control of a domain, granted them that code signing certificate. Now, that wasn't code signing for Windows Update, thankfully, but it would have enabled them to code sign things like, anybody remember ActiveX? Or Office macros? All of that stuff they could have code signed and done malicious things with. I remember that. That's how big a deal that was back at the time. CAs are fooled or sometimes just decide to take the money and give arguably bad actors their own subordinate CA certificates. Okay, this one happened, I think it was back in 2011. A CA named TrustWave decided they were going to, at the request of one of their customer came to them and said, we want to be able to monitor TLS communications within our own network. The only way we can do that is if we can essentially man-in-the-middle attack SSL coming through our network and going out to the internet. So what we need is a CA certificate, basically an intermediate CA certificate, signed by a trusted CA, that's you, that we can then use to issue certificates on the fly for any domain people are trying to connect to with SSL. And if you have that capability, then you can subvert that connection. The person on the other end, the only way that they would know that connection is not legitimate is if they actually looked at the certificate securing it and said, well, that comes from TrustWave, and that's not supposed to come from TrustWave. Okay? Now, that's not something that was commonly done back then. You do see schemes to do that now, but those schemes have side effects like, what if you, as a server administrator, decide you don't want to do business with a particular certificate authority anymore, and for your renewal, you change to another authority? Now, any certificate that had that old authority pinned as the legitimate authority is going to say, hey, that looks suspicious, even though it's not really. But in this case, it was very suspicious, and it was only found out because they changed their terms of service. And they changed their terms of service in a very squirrely-looking way, and everybody kind of went, why did you say that thing in that exact way? And then they eventually wrote a blog post about what they had done, and of all the major browser makers, the only one that went back to them and said, we demand to know more about this, was Mozilla. Okay? We don't know if anybody else has ever done this, because nobody's self-disclosed, nobody's ever been able to prove it, but it would actually be very hard to prove. CA system vulnerabilities can be exploited, okay? And not necessarily system vulnerabilities in the CA, although some of them are. You can actually have a CA give you a legitimate certificate that allows you to exploit client vulnerabilities. If you go back and you look at Moxie Marlinspike, who I'm going to mention again later, I believe it was one of the original SSL stripping attacks that he came up with, where he would get a certificate that had a null character in the middle of the domain name, and that would cause the client to think that it was a certificate for like www.paypal.com. Okay, but it was actually a certificate for www.paypal.com, null character, thoughtcrime.org, which was his domain. So totally valid. He sent it into a CA. He got it validated, which it should have validated because he was getting a certificate for his domain. But it was a certificate formatted in a particular way that exploited client parsing issues. Okay, so that's not great. Because of all these issues, certificates must sometimes be revoked. Okay, there are no good ways of doing that. All right. The main way, the oldest way, is your CA publishes a revocation list. And that revocation list is a list of every certificate that CA has ever revoked going all the way back to the beginning of time. Okay? Theoretically, if a certificate has already expired, you don't have to include it in a CRL because it's already expired and the browser should reject it on that basis. But typically, I think they do include even those old expired ones just for transparency purposes. Obviously, CRLs can get really big. The other problem is if you're trying to check a certificate, you have to download the entire revocation list to check whether that certificate has been expired. So essentially, nobody did this because it would just impose too much of a delay every time you wanted to SSL transact with a website. So somebody came up with OCSP, the Online Certificate Status Protocol. All right? That allows your browser to query an endpoint that is listed in the certificate for the validity of that certificate, just that one. It says, this is the certificate I have, is it valid or not? And the OCSP endpoint says, yes it is, or no, it's been revoked. But that means that every time you go to a website, you're telling a third party what website you went to. And they are getting your IP address inherently because of that OCSP transaction. It also requires that the responder never, ever, 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 ever go down. Because if it does, then any client that's enforcing OCSP is going to just simply fail to connect to their website. It's going to say, I can't verify, so no connection for you. So they invented OCSP stapling. That's where the server goes out and gets an OCSP response preemptively, staples it to the certificate, sends that whole bundle down to the client. Now the client can verify because it has the OCSP endpoint certificate. It can verify that this stapled verification is valid. That means the certificate's valid, etc. A lot of clients don't bother. They just go ahead and query anyway. So you still have all the same problems, but you kind of think you solved them, but you didn't really for probably most people. It's not always an innocent mistake. There have been multiple instances where CAs were believed to be acting on behalf of a state actor or other rogue actor knowingly and intentionally, not that they were subverted or hacked or fooled. They knowingly colluded with a bad actor to issue rogue certificates. Okay? So the measure that was come up with for this was called certificate transparency. The idea is that every certificate ever issued by any CA, because there's no way to detect this, if nobody knows what certificates were issued and the CA doesn't volunteer that info, you never know until it's too late, right? It's a valid certificate from a valid CA that you trusted. It just happens to be given to a rogue actor. So they came up with certificate transparency. There's a transparency log somewhere, and every certificate that CA writes is written to a transparency log. Usually more than one, okay? So if you are a domain owner, you can then check transparency logs to see if anybody has issued a certificate for your domain who shouldn't have, okay? But what if the CA just doesn't bother to report because they know they're being bad, right? Why would they volunteer information that they're being malicious? So to guard against that, browsers typically will not accept, or at least I know this is how Firefox works, will not accept a certificate as valid unless it shows up in multiple transparency logs. Okay? But there are some situations, because of how long it takes these things to get into the log, where essentially it's a valid certificate, it should be accepted, but it's going to take a few hours yet to get it into the transparency log. So there's this idea of a transparency promise. It's the it's the log saying, I promise that I will add this certificate to the log by this expiration time. Okay, and the browser then will accept that. But what happens if you get that promise, and then, again, what happens if you have a malicious CA colluding with a malicious log? You have a gap there, and it's because of the practicalities of how things have worked for the last 30 years. Okay, multiple logs. The other thing is, most browsers, we go back to this idea of implicit trust again. Which logs do they query? Well, it's up to the browser maker. Which logs do they trust? I think Firefox trusts 6, I believe. Google for Chrome had some small number of logs they trusted, and for a while, they had a rule that one of those logs had to be the Google transparency log. Can you control which CAs issue your certificates? No. Why would you want to do that? Any CA can issue a certificate for your domain. Okay? The best you can do is you can publish a record in your DNS that says, these are the CAs that I have gotten certificates from that I allow to issue certificates for me. How is that enforced? It's self-enforced. It's up to the CAs to query your CAA records, and then if they don't see themselves in that CAA record, to refuse to issue that certificate. And if they make a mistake, or if they decide to ignore it, or they just don't know that's a thing they should do, they should know that because, as we're going to talk about, there's the CA browser forum. But in any of those scenarios, if that didn't happen and that rogue certificate got issued, too bad. This ultimate trust model enables other things that are basically only possible in the form they are because of it. Okay, so in early 2015, Lenovo was shipping laptops that had software installed on them called Superfish. And Superfish came bundled with a CA certificate and the private key embedded in the whole assemblage. And that allowed Superfish to do the same thing that was done by that certificate that TrustWave issued. Essentially, in the configuration that it was in, it was an adware injector. Okay, so it was man in the middle attacking your SSL connections to inject ads into them. All right? Everybody got upset about this. It was heavily covered in the tech press. Lenovo was dragged through the coals. So, of course, that never happened again, right? No. Dell did the same thing 6 months later. Now, in Dell's case, they weren't doing it for adware. What they were doing it for was something related to their online support. So the idea was this was part of their capability of Dell support people remotely connecting to your device. But the fact that they did it at all, that they didn't learn from the Lenovo issue, is just baffling. Like, literally waited for the hype to die down over that and then went, let's do that ourselves. All right, well, it's a mess. But it mostly works, right? It's basically okay. There's a small set of trusted CAs. We basically know who they are. We basically know we can trust them. It's pretty much fine, right? No, not at all. Never has been. You wish. Now, that is actually a clickable link. When you go to the slides online, if you click on that link and open it in the News tab, there will be a timeline of all the issues and developments in SSL and TLS over the years, going all the way back to the beginning. Now, some of them are positive developments. Things like, well, we developed TLS to replace SSL because SSL had issues. Or we developed TLS, 1.2, 1.3. Most of them are not positive. Most of them are things like this CA was detrusted because they got hacked. DigiNotar, okay? They got hacked and totally subverted, and the attackers issued thousands and thousands of rogue certificates. There was no way back for them, okay? Symantec, same thing. DigiNotar was 2011. Symantec was 2017, 2016, and Symantec had to stop being a CA. They sold all of their CA business to DigiCert. Just recently, you would think that all of this mostly tapered off over time. Just recently, Entrust, same thing. 2023, Google, Firefox announced they are no longer going to trust Entrust certificates issued after late 2024 because, frankly, they could not trust Entrust. And we're still seeing some of the fallout of that. The other thing is, How do you get the notification, or I should say, because I know we in this room always run our OS and application updates as soon as they're announced, right? Yep. Of course we do. We never ever click that button that says install this later, okay? But a lot of our parents do. A lot of our other relatives do. A lot of our coworkers do, all right? And until they get those updates, they are still using browser versions that don't recognize that they shouldn't accept those hack certificates. They're still using operating systems that have those now detrusted CAs in there as fully trusted CAs. It's a real mess. Basically, until everybody on the internet downloads all of the updates that are queued up for them, somebody out there is vulnerable and doesn't even know it yet because they haven't gotten the update yet. How many public CAs are we talking about? Show of hands, or actually, just call some numbers out. Who here has a guess as to how many CAs are typically in your trust store? Okay, those are actually pretty close numbers. The numbers that I've seen, depending on the time, range from the 70s to the middle 200s, okay? But there's a trick. It's not consistent. There are wildly differing numbers of CAs that are trusted depending on your particular configuration of browser and operating system, and that means that the set of CAs is not a unified set, okay? And it's constantly changing, and it's just a lot for even a major OS or browser vendor to keep up with. Something in the neighborhood of 100 to 250. I've seen it as low as 75, in older articles. How do they get there? We asked that before, right? Remember I asked that question and I kind of just hand waved away and kept going. Well, the CA browser forum puts them there, essentially. They don't really literally put them there, but members of the CA browser forum who are OS and browser vendors, which is most of the major ones, do put them in their trust stores based on essentially CA browser forum decisions taken collectively, okay? Well, who are they? Huh? What's that? It seems like it sometimes. I have seen articles back in the day that were like, did you know that there is this generally untrusted rogue state run by an oppressive dictatorship, and their CA is in everybody's trust store? Should it be? Maybe not. Maybe. But sometimes it seems like they just get added because they're an official state-run CA, and nobody wants to be the one to say, we don't trust your country. So, who are the CA browser forum? Now, I'm just going to put a quote up here from one of my favorite old comedians. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. Okay, now that's not to say that they're doing things maliciously or secretively. I don't want to give that impression. But if you, as a person, don't believe that you should particularly trust a particular certificate authority, what are you going to do about that? I mean, you can go in and you can manually remove it from your operating system or your browser trust store, if you can figure out how to do that. But the likelihood that any individual person's report of, I don't like the fact that this CA is trusted to the CA browser forum is going to actually result in any action is pretty low, unless you're bringing evidence of some major breach of security, like the DigiNotar hack, or like the CA that apparently knowingly issued certificates for Gmail. That's happened. And it appears that they knew exactly what they were doing when they did it, and that they did it on behalf of a state actor. Okay, so it's a big mess. But if it's such a big mess, why isn't anybody else saying it's a big mess? Well, they are saying it's a big mess. Okay, remember I mentioned Moxie Marlinspike before? He did a Black Hat presentation in 2011, and that's a YouTube video that is linked there. And he laid all this out. He said, we cannot do things the way we've been doing them up to this point. The ultimate trust of this relatively small number of certificate authorities that are very hard to untrust and are dug so deep into the infrastructure of the internet is the whole root of the problem. We need some way to at least, watch the authorities, right? And so he came up with this thing called TAC. And I'm blanking on what TAC actually stands for, but he co-authored, it's an IETF draft. It's still out there, okay? Somebody came up with another proposal. They said, well, okay, if we need to verify identity, we already do that with the domain name registration system. People register a domain, their identity is known to some extent, or at least, if we don't know who they are in a corporate sense, we at least know that they registered a domain. And if they're using DNSSEC, then we have a key in that domain that we can cryptographically trust to be the proper key controlled by that entity that registered that domain. We know that they are the same entity. So if they're using DNSSEC, then we can do, somebody came up with an implementation of Dane called Dane TLSA. Okay? So all that fixed everything, right? No. Nobody really did anything with either one of them. I mean, Moxie Marlinspike really, really tried. He started a company called Convergence. He submitted that IETF draft. The people who did the Dane TLSA RFC, I mean, they really sat down and thought about what the problem really was, just like the people who set out the Dane's, standard document did. All that work, I remember, I forget which one it was, but somebody basically said, hey, when is Chrome going to support this? And the people that make Google Chrome said, we're not going to, because we don't think anybody will really care. And therefore, it's not to our benefit to actually support this in Chrome because it derives no benefit. All right. So that's the current situation. Where are we going from here? It really is that bad. What are we going to do? Well, you already know what I'm going to say. Okay? I really believe there's only the one option at this point. Okay? It's all hacks, built on hacks, built on hacks, built on hacks. I don't think it's possible to save it anymore. I think we have to wipe the slate clean. Okay? It's the classic XKCD. This was the one that everybody was passing around when the guy unpublished left pad and half of the web broke. Okay, it's that situation, but imagine that thing is sitting on top of a tall, skinny column of skinny vertical blocks, and they're all labeled. A CA that you don't really know whether you can trust or not. What do we replace all this with? I said I don't really have solutions, right? No authoritative solutions. But I think we can get a general idea of the parameters of what needs to happen. We're going to have to give up the idea that just any CA that some set of browser makers, OS vendors, other interested parties, that is relatively small and essentially self-selected, although self-selected with the best of intentions, I honestly believe that. We got to give up the idea that that group gets to choose for everybody else on the internet who is ultimately trusted. Unless that set of ultimately trusted parties were very, very small, or unless that set of ultimately trusted parties had guardrails around them to say, you can't issue just any certificate for anyone. There's going to be controls. You can only issue certificates for people who say, you get to issue my certificates. And if they revoke that permission, then you literally will be unable to in some way. It can't be a self-enforced thing like CAA is now. We've got to have some mechanism for detrusting incompetent or subverted CAs right away. We cannot sit around and use the current system of waiting on everybody to get every OS update that is in their queue. That is just not workable for the future. How many people here are on the latest service pack of whatever OS, or service pack, version, annual release, whatever? I know I'm not. Maybe 1, 2, 3 people are, or at least are claiming they are. I'm not calling anyone a liar, but there have been plenty of times when somebody would say, do you have the latest service pack of Windows on your workstation? And I went, yeah. And they went, the one that was released last Tuesday? Oh, no. So we need to be able to detrust these CAs immediately, not by waiting for everybody to download updates. Okay? We may. This is kind of the nightmare scenario, right? But we may just have to give up the idea that there is any in-band identity verification. That basically means there won't be CAs anymore. Okay? I hope we don't have to do that, because that is a major architectural change to the foundation of the internet. So I really hope we don't have to do that, but we might have to. We might find out that it really is that far gone. At the very minimum, I think we're going to have to give up the idea of the absolute trust of CAs and replace it with some kind of idea of like web of trust. Anybody ever heard that term before? Yeah, a few people. And there the idea would be, instead of you having an ultimately trusted certificate in your browser OS certificate store, your certificate would still be there, but the trust of that certificate would be based on the collective trust of all the other entities represented there. And that would be verified basically in real time, periodically. And if some CA needs to be detrusted, then instead of a period of days or weeks waiting for everybody to download and install updates, it just happens. The next time somebody opens their browser and it checks for CA trust, and it says, oh, wait, we detrusted, DigiNotar, because I don't even know why, but I just know that every other CA now says DigiNotar is absolutely untrusted, so I'm going to untrust it as well. I think we're going to need some mechanism like that. Are we really going to do this? I think we have to. I mean, I've made that fairly clear. In that scenario, I think everybody involved in the TLS infrastructure of the internet, the CAs, the browser makers, the OS makers, the major financial institutions who obviously have a financial interest in this all working well for the long term, everybody's going to have to start having really serious conversations on a deep technical level about what we are going to do about this. Because, if they don't, it's just going to keep doing what it's doing, and eventually, realistically, if we don't do that, and I have a strong suspicion that we don't do that, we're just going to pretend everything is fine. Some major catastrophe is going to happen, and then instead of moving to a new system in an orderly fashion with migration plans and all that, we're going to have to do it overnight. We're going to have to do it with a lot of pain and trouble and chaos, and we're not going to have a choice because it's going to be either that or quit using the internet for stuff. So, not a great scenario, but I think that's where we are. All right, so wrapping up, we've got about 15 minutes left, so that's actually pretty good. Final thoughts: don't panic, okay? But do get concerned, okay? I hope if I've done anything here, it's get at least a few people in this room and go, oh, I did not realize that it was actually as bad as it was. It really is that bad. Somebody really needs to do something about it, okay? Get informed. Like I said, this stuff is fractally bad. There's a lot to learn about it, and most of it is not great to learn. Some of it is actually hard to dig into and understand on a technical level, but some of it is hard to dig into and understand because, frankly, a lot of the people involved don't like to give details when people find out that they've not been doing their job right. And then get loud. And I say, and then get loud. Get informed first, then get loud, okay? There's not that many people in this room. There's a couple dozen people in this room. I mean, I am under no illusions that I'm speaking to, addressing the United Nations here. But we're all very technically connected people in this room. Somebody in this room knows somebody at Google, somebody at Apple, somebody at Amazon, somebody at Mozilla, that if they really wanted to, could contact somebody else at those institutions. And if that person really wanted to, they could start the conversation about fixing this. Okay, so we all need to get louder, more persistent, start demanding from our browser makers and our OS makers and our, everybody else who has a financial stake in this or any other reputational stake in this, fix it. Don't just keep going like you've been going. Make it work. Make it work so that it will work for the next 50 years. Or at least make it work in some way that it doesn't have the same failings that it's had for the last 30. That is my last slide. So thank you. That is the QR code, and I have a little tiny URL there that goes to the online version of these slides. We have about 15 minutes, so I will be happy to take questions from anybody in the audience who wishes to ask me for more details, argue with me, tell me that I'm being super paranoid and don't need to be, whatever the case may be.
Not a question, but more like direction of thought. You mentioned the web of trust, but I also, just an idea to put some thoughts on is that CAs essentially, signing parties essentially is a personal trust. That's one mode that we had. And then CA is essentially institutionalized trust with non-public institutions, essentially. Right? Then we can talk about institutionalized trust with public institutions like UN, state, and so on. And then there's other modes of trust, such as like credentials, such as original trust, which exists in human society, and it's actually very strong, but we kind of stay away from it in the internet because we're trying to be global, but in fact, humans actually trust people from the same town as them.
There are actually a couple of things that I can bounce off that. One of them is, in the US, if you're talking about, especially if you're talking about institutional cybersecurity, who are we talking about? Somebody knows. What government agency are we talking about that is basically in charge of US government cybersecurity? NSA, National Security Agency, right? Their job to break other people's encryption, their job to make sure our own government's encryption is top-notch, okay? Who issues the NSA's CA certificate? I looked at this last night and I had to laugh because the TLS certificate for NSA.gov is issued by Entrust. Now, that happens to be Entrust. A lot of the US government uses Let's Encrypt. I don't have an issue with that, right? It's a nonprofit. I mean, I hope that they're at least funding it in some way, because it looks like a lot of the US government uses it now. But you see other agencies use other certificates from other CAs. I'm kind of confused as to why the US government buys commercial CA certificates at all. Go ahead. Hold on, we got the mic coming around.
Suspecting the NSA, it's probably in honeypot.
Has a what?
Using Entrust is probably a honeypot.
I mean, it might be, but if all you're doing is browsing the NSA website, I mean, sure, that's one theory. I think it's just more like the more likely thing, because I worked in government contracting for several years, was whichever contractor set that up had a relationship with Entrust at some point and said, okay, we'll just go to our certificate partner and get all the certificates we need for this. The other thing that I was going to say about that is, there was a plan way back in the early days of the internet. Somebody said, well, okay, if we need a trustworthy, secure email service for American citizens essentially as a public utility, why don't we have the US Postal Service do it, right? You just go down to the post office, you sign up for your email account, and that's your email account, right? And there were also various things where people said, hey, then the post office, for people who didn't have computers, could even print their email and stick it in their mailbox. I don't think that would necessarily be a thing today, but why not have some trusted authority issue or allow them to issue certificates, right? Allow there to be a public institution in the United States, and you don't have to use it, but it's there, right? We kind of have that, but it's not a government institution. It's just Let's Encrypt, okay? And they're great. I love them. I give them money every year because I want them to keep doing what they're doing. But they're a nonprofit, There's no guarantee that they will continue to exist arbitrarily far out. I feel reasonably certain that the US government itself will continue to exist in some form to an arbitrarily far point in the future. And then we got one over here. Yeah.
A question. What do you make of Google's idea of reducing the certificate validity to 90 days? What is the rationale behind? It's already a nightmare for me to be changing certificates every year. So every 90 days, what is their rationale?
It used to be.
Is it because of all this mess?
Yeah, I think it is because of this mess, because it used to be that you would get certificates for multiple years. 5 years was common, 3 years was common. Then they started reducing it to 1 year. Then they started reducing it to a few months. In an environment where you have, if you have some vendor that's trying to sell you a zero trust product, they will advertise their capability to issue certificates on demand that are basically ephemeral. They're basically only valid for a few minutes or a few seconds. And it's because of this kind of thing. It's because there's only one reliable way to make sure that a certificate that needs to be untrusted is untrusted, and that's for it to have expired. And so if you have a 5-year issued certificate and the CA revoked it the day after it was issued and everybody just didn't get that update, they don't know. They have no way to know. Okay? But if that certificate was only valid for 3 months, then relatively speaking, in 3 months it won't matter anyway.
So going up here and back on the nation state question also, like how Let's Encrypt works, do you think you would see like an international body doing this, or do you think that's going to turn into like the other XKCD, which says, let's add another standard? There are now 11 competing standards.
I love that one. There are 15 standards. Let's have one big one. Now there are 16 standards. I think we are going to end up seeing something like, there is an international body that does a lot of things, I think over here and then over there. There are international bodies that do things for the internet. There is a DNS root that is maintained by an international body. Now, a lot of people don't like that particular international body for a lot of reasons, but it exists. It mostly does what it's there to do. Okay, I think we are going to have to come together, and there's going to have to be some kind of international, internet-wide authority that actively monitors and, to some extent, polices all this, rather than it just being all the commercial entities who bothered to care got together and said, yeah, we're going to do it because nobody else is. I think over here, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with quantum computing coming up, that's going to destroy it, the whole CA. So it's kind of like we are forced.
Well, that's one of the things that was pointed out about the DANE protocol. If you have DANE and you have DNSSEC and you trust your DNSSEC and the DANE is properly implemented, you don't need a CA because you just put your keys directly in as DANE records. TLSA records is what they're called. And you don't need a CA because your identity has already been verified through your domain registration and your DNSSEC keys. So yeah, there is no need for a certificate at that point, although there is for certain things. And those certain things are, and I mentioned this, and I actually didn't put a slide in it because I felt like I was running low on what time I was going to have. One of the things I mentioned in the abstract for this talk was the commercial incentives of CAs to do things that are questionable. Okay, one of those questionable things was like that CA that issued that intermediate cert to a customer. Okay, that's highly questionable. But there was also this thing, and it was a thing for a while, and it never really took off, and I'm actually kind of glad it didn't take off. It was called extended verification certificates. The idea was you have 3 levels of verification. One is domain verification, right? All that involves is somebody at the CA emailed the administrative contact on your domain and said, is this a valid request for a certificate for this domain? And they would get a response back that would say yes or no, and then they would issue or not issue on that basis. Then there was organizational validation, where they would do basically a quick records check and say, okay, this is being issued for what looks like a business entity. Does that business entity actually exist? Do the records of its existence say that it basically exists where it claims to exist in this registration request? Then there was extended verification, okay? And that was, we actually essentially send somebody out to your office to go talk to your people, make sure that you're fully on the up and up, that you have a physical presence, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that all sounds great, but one of the reasons that the CAs pushed EV so hard for so long was they charged money for that. That was not something you could get for free. What they wanted was a world where browsers would treat EV certificates very preferentially and non-EV certificates very non-preferentially, and therefore everybody would have to pay the certificate authority for EV validation. They would have made a lot of money in that world. Now, you could argue, well, the real reason they wanted it is so that that, whoever set up this domain and claimed to be Citibank is actually Citibank, and that Citibank is a real thing, right? That's part of it, but I'm sure the money part didn't hurt.
We had a question over here.
To what extent is part of the solution here just, internet clients taking more agency or responsibility for kind of assessing for themselves risk risk tolerance, and like what are the constraints that, or what is their desires, what is their threat model, and what is the security model they're trying to achieve? Just because I imagine like maybe there's some clients that not all internet clients or humans behind the internet clients are going to be sophisticated enough probably to make this determination for themselves, but even a statement such as like revocation should be immediate rather than like this eventually consistent thing that maybe trends on Hacker News. But I imagine like there are probably, if we sat down and thought of some use cases, like maybe not all clients are completely equal in their threat models, and like maybe for some people it is kind of okay if this sort of eventual consistency enforced by game theory to kind of raise the cost and raise the stakes so that to keep like the CAs in line with things like transparency logs and, you're going to trend on Hacker News probably if someone catches you. And maybe, there's some enhancements we can do to strengthen the game theory there.
The clients have to be part of the solution, but they're also a big part of the problem. And part of the problem is that because of the absolute dominance, and that absolute dominance has changed parties over time. Used to be Microsoft with Internet Explorer. Before that, it was Netscape, with Netscape Navigator. Okay, currently, the absolutely dominant party in web browser clients is Google with Chrome. What that means is if Google doesn't want to implement some solution that requires changes to a client, it's not going to happen. Because they control, 80, 85, 90% of the browser market right now. And for anybody else to implement that, when the most good that it will ever do is solve 10% of the problem, if Google doesn't do it, basically nobody else does it either. So it's going to have to be, I think, client changes are going to be necessary, but they will not be sufficient to actually solve the problem. We're basically going to have the clients be a fallback. It's like, hey, the system basically works, but if something goes really horribly wrong, the client is the ultimate fallback and can kind of call foul and throw a flag on the play and say, I don't trust this. Everything tells me to, but I don't. But you can't depend on that fallback to actually happen. You just have to hope that it's there if you need it.
How are we doing on time?
I think we have 2 more minutes, then we got to be out of here.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. What do you feel about the involvement of needing an ASN to transfer mail between some of the larger servers? And also, do you see any prospect for a TLS proxy that goes through and validates the certificates in midstream? Anything like that?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. That's a little beyond how far I've thought this through at this point. Yeah. I mean, it's going to require, like I said, it's going to require major changes on the client end, but it's also going to require major architectural changes and organizational practice changes on the server side of things. And we're probably going to have to come up with some institutions that we just don't have right now, of a type that we don't even have, to do the jobs that need to be done to actually solve these problems. I think we got time for one more, if anybody has one more.
Going once. Going twice. Oh, in the back.
Oh, great. Get that last one in.
So you mentioned that an issue with Dane was that it didn't go anywhere. Do you think a solution to this problem is putting more into making it go somewhere?
Wait, say that again?
So you mentioned that Dane's problem was it didn't go anywhere. Do you think making it go somewhere would solve the problems?
I think it would go a long way to helping solve the problem. I actually really do kind of hope that somebody at some point picks Dane back up again, or even picks up Attack again and says, we need to do one of those or both of these. And that's going to, I mean, if you do one, you solve part of the problem, right? That's better than solving none of it. I don't think either one is going to be a complete for all time solution. A complete for all time solution may not exist, but I think something like those at least is going to be part of whatever the ultimate solution is. I think that's our time. I got 2:46 right now.
All right.